So I wanted to welcome everyone and to say how thrilled I am that we have 91 people here for this Northeastern's second community conversation. And this community conversation is about police reform, criminal justice reform, and police accountability. This session is being recorded, and we hope to post it on YouTube after the discussion. So to all 94 of you now, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have you. And if you're interested in discussing or learning more about police reform, accountability, or criminal justice reform, we urge you to consider joining our new criminal justice task force, where we are working on strategies and initiatives to make the criminal justice system fairer and more just. If you're interested in that, you can contact me or Kenny Lawton. Our moderator for today's discussion is Childress, and we're thrilled to have him here. He is a joint degree student, both at our law school, where, this is the most important part, he's in my race, justice, and reform class. And he is also a graduate student at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. He's going to be introducing our panel today. Chase?
Thanks, Professor, and thank you all for coming. I'm super excited to introduce our esteemed panelists. So first, we have Suffolk County District Attorney Rachael Rollins is the Chief Law Enforcement Official for Boston, Chelsea, Revere, and Winthrop, Massachusetts, and she oversees an office of approximately 300 people, handling about 35,000 new cases each year. She took office on January 2nd, 2019 as Suffolk County's 16th district attorney, the first woman to be elected to that position in Suffolk County history, and the first woman of color to ever serve as a Massachusetts district attorney. An attorney for 20 years with degrees from Northeastern School of Law and Georgetown University Law Center, District Attorney Rollins is also a former Governor Deval Patrick appointee to the Judicial Nominating Committee and a past president of the Massachusetts Black Lawyers Association. We are so grateful to have you here, DA Rollins. Thank you. Next is Reverend Willie Bodrick II. He is a graduate of Georgetown University, Harvard Divinity School, and Northeastern University School of Law, and he is now the associate pastor for the historic 12th Baptist Church in Roxbury. He is a senior advisor to Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey, and originally from Atlanta, Reverend Bodrick became deeply involved in the community in Massachusetts during his time here and went on to serve in A.G. Maura Healey's office as outreach coordinator. He's worked with a number of district attorneys, police departments, and community members in pursuit of reform and racial justice. He also served on the transition team for Rachael Rollins when she was elected, and he came to speak with our class, and we are so grateful that he's come to speak with us again today. Last but not least, we have Professor Deborah Ramirez, who is a graduate of Northwestern University and Harvard Law School, and has worked as an assistant U.S. attorney and has handled appeals before the First Circuit. She has given congressional testimony before the U.S. House of Representatives a number of times on issues of racial profiling and policing strategy, and has a number of papers and articles on various topics of police reform. She has recently been published in the Boston Globe and has appeared on ABC News' Good Morning America, as well as a number of podcasts to discuss reform ideas, including police liability insurance. Professor Ramirez currently teaches criminal law at Northeastern, as well as race justice and reform. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
So, if everyone is all right with it, I think we'll just jump right into the questions.
Sure.
Is that okay? Great. So first, could you each describe your background and experience with the criminal justice system? Does DA Rollins, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'd be honored. And what you didn't say was Professor Ramirez was my evidence professor. So I'm super just honored to be back here with her. So my background with the criminal legal system is very interesting. I am the product of a multicultural family. My dad is second generation from Mayo, Ireland. My mom is first generation from Barbados. My dad is a Vietnam War veteran and was a former corrections officer. His brothers were in the state police for one of them decades. Both of them served in the military. He has many other male relatives that were in law enforcement. So I grew up with a very deep respect for the military, veterans, and law enforcement, which I still have deep, deep, deep as a child. I also have siblings that have unfortunately cycled in and out of the criminal legal system at the county, state, and federal level. And a story that many people don't know is that I too used to be an assistant United States attorney, not at the same time as Professor Ramirez, but I started in the civil division, did some asset forfeiture work, and then transitioned over to work with John Wortman and Glenn McKinley, handling a lot of sort of gang, gun, and drug cases, big, big, big takedowns there. And after I left, one of my brothers was arrested by federal agents, and I walked back into the Moakley courthouse, this time not as an assistant United States attorney, but as the sibling or loved one of a criminal defendant. And it was a very different experience. And I was a beloved former employee, right? So if I felt the tangible difference when I walked into Judge Sorokin's courtroom and he looked at me and smiled and sort of made this kind of, what are you doing here? As I walked in, because he knew I had already left the office to go have another job. And then when my brother walked out handcuffed, Judge Sorokin's face just dropped because it became very clear we favor each other quite a bit, that I was there in support of my loved one. And in fact, Glenn McKinley, who used to be my supervisor at the US Attorney's Office, was the person prosecuting my younger brother. They, of course, once they realized that, you know, had to get another assistant US attorney to help. But that is a very tangible, real experience I had that I remember every day. I felt different. I was treated differently. It wasn't overt, but it was very obvious. And if that's me, imagine people who know nobody in that courthouse. Imagine people who English might not be their first language, and they have questions when they walk in about where are they going, where is my loved one, and they are met with armed people going through metal detectors. They're very nice when they know you, sometimes maybe not so much when they don't. So my experience has been varied. My experience has been excellent in some circumstances and not so excellent in others. And that is not just with prosecutors and judges in probation, but very candidly also with court-appointed counsel on the criminal defense side. And so that is not a disparagement of them. None of us are above, reproach with respect to this system, but I have had exceptional court-appointed counsel, and then ones that I have called on behalf of my loved ones and never received phone calls back or felt like I had to beg and plead just for the decency of an explanation. So that is my experience with the system.
I'll follow up. Thank you, DA Rollins, for setting the tone, and I'm glad to be here with my professor, Professor Ramirez, who is my criminal justice and criminal law professor, as well as race justice and reform. I'm a 32-year-old Black man who's a husband, who's a father, who's a brother, who's a friend, and I serve in the capacity of associate pastor at the historic 12th Baptist Church. I can think very clearly of the various touch points that the criminal justice system has had on my life. As a young person, even as growing up in Atlanta public schools, I remember as young as 11 years old, daily walking through metal detectors, my first day of middle school, and having the presence of police, the very first persons you see at the door. I remember as a young man, one of my friends being arrested and taken away at 12 years old for a 10-year bid for a crime that he committed. and having to deal with adults trying to explain to us what happened to our teammate and our friend. I remember being in college at Georgetown University and being profiled constantly by campus police as well as DCPS, PD, excuse me, and dealing with the constant barraging of just being a Black body in the presence of a predominantly white institution. I remember going to law school and having this burning desire to do the work, even post Trayvon Martin in Divinity School, going out and protesting against some of the actions like Michael Brown's killing and being in Ferguson and standing in community with people. I also been in the Moakley Courthouse. I was able to serve as a judicial clerk intern with Judge Denise Casper and to see various Black and brown bodies cycle in and out in those institutions, but also to look at the white collar crime and to see in the ways in which the disparities of treatment, as were discussed, of those who are coming in for various reasons. In my ministerial capacity, I've also had the opportunity to work closely with law enforcement. We do peace walks in our community, but for COVID this year, we will be out here doing peace walks right now. We know that this is something that we've done for years at our church, working in community, trying to work with law enforcement to bridge the gap between community and law enforcement, and to hopefully build a better understanding between communities. Each and every year, we work very closely with children whose parents are incarcerated. And we do programming throughout the year, culminating in a huge program that we do for Christmas, providing gifts and support to those families with children whose parents are incarcerated. We've also worked very closely with Sheriff Tompkins and the work that he does with those who are in South Bay and that institution, and working closely with them to support those persons who were in probation. Particularly during the COVID season, we were blessed to give some funding to support those families who did not receive funding from the federal government. And I was also very blessed to work under another alum, Attorney General Maura Healey, who appointed me at the age of 26 to work as the outreach coordinator for the state, overseeing 4 regional offices. And in that capacity, I work very closely with both DAs, work closely with police departments, and be able to think critically about how can government better do their job. And so I've had various touch points, been on both sides of the issue, and been able to experience the criminal justice system writ large, and hopefully be able to give insight to how we can do a better job doing the work that we do.
Okay, my involvement with criminal justice began after I graduated, when I became an assistant US attorney. And it didn't take me long, and I'm sure Rachel had the same experience, to see that most of the defendants in the courthouse were Latinx, were Black, came from very disadvantaged backgrounds. And I felt and knew that the system was disproportionately impacting the community of color. And I wondered what systemic things could be done to address that, to address 2 issues: mass incarceration and the disproportionate impact of the system on people of color. And so I began working with the Department of Justice on racial profiling issues, and eventually co-authored a guide on racial profiling data collection systems: what data to collect, what data to analyze, and how to analyze it. And that experience brought me to a lot of hearings about police shootings and stranglings. And in each of these hearings, I spoke to the families who had lost a loved one, and began to ask myself what we could do to stop the shootings, what we could do to reform policing. And the paper that I most recently wrote is about professional liability insurance, but it began when Gwen Carr stood up at a conference that I was at and asked a question. She said, "Why is it that my son, Eric Garner, who was strangled to death by Daniel Pontalillo, why is it that that officer is still on the New York City police force 4 years after my son died?" And she said, "I know he was selling single cigarettes, and I know that was wrong, but he didn't deserve to be strangled to death. And I want to know why it is that that officer still sits in the New York City Police Department 4 years later." And at that point, part of me thought, the system is broken. and also that Gwen Carr deserved an answer to what the problem is and a solution. And so that has put me on my current path. But beyond police accountability, I've been asking questions broader about police culture and about reimagining policing and reimagining how we spend our municipal dollars.
Thank you. Wow. So my next question is really, given your wealth and depth of experience with the criminal justice system, what is your vision for policing in America? And if you could reimagine it, what would it look like? If you don't mind, we could go again in the same order. So DA Rollins.
So, you know, I think about this a lot, and I'm part of law enforcement, right? So as the chief law enforcement officer in Suffolk County, which is not just Boston, it's Boston, Chelsea, Winthrop, and Revere, I am trying to create that as we speak in the 17 months that I've been DA. So one of the things I'm most proud of when you hear Professor Ramirez talk about Daniel Pantaleo, remember, Eric Gardner, that's a civil infraction, selling a single cigarette. That's a ticketable offense. And a man is dead as a result of that, right? And then if we fast forward, that was July 17th, 2014, I believe. If we fast forward, 6 years, we have George Floyd, right? And same mistakes happening. Passing a $20 counterfeit bill is a misdemeanor, even in places like Alabama and Kentucky and Kentuckabama or wherever other places are down south, right? So the point is that this man lost his life in 8 minutes and 46 seconds. George Floyd was tried, convicted, sentenced, and executed by Eric Gardner. The only difference in that, and it's still taking too long in that 6 years almost, is Daniel Pantaleo wasn't terminated until 5 years later. George Floyd was executed. Derek Chauvin was terminated within 24 hours or 48 hours. But there are still 2 black men that are gone. They are dead. And I know this sounds childish to say, but I am so much more aware now as DA, having dealt with so many homicides, of the finality of death, right? And some of you on here might have lost a loved one or a nana or a vovo or someone you care about that I hope died in old age and lived a rich and full and complete and amazing life. But when I am on Mount Pleasant Street and there's a 15-year-old that was killed, Latinx young man who was murdered, these are lives stolen. So what I try to do is lead in my office profoundly and in broad changing fashion. So one of the first things I did was create a discharge integrity team. Right now, where we find ourselves with all this tension between law enforcement and communities are completely 100% correct in not trusting DAs to investigate the police, because as many of you know, in 95% of our cases, we walk in hand with the police. There are key witnesses, we have great working relationships, and we should. But how are they to believe that then, when that officer that we have a great relationship with discharges his or her weapon and harms a resident, that we are going to say, oh, no, we promise we're not biased with him. And then if we look at the data, it is incredibly rare for officers to ever be held accountable, let alone charged in certain circumstances. And we see that with Ahmaud Arbery, where 3 different DAs looked at that horrific lynching of Ahmaud Arbery by the McMichaels and the other one, and said, nope, this looks great because Georgia has a citizen's arrest statute and we think this is completely lawful. Same thing even with George Floyd, where the DA there in a punt tried to disparage Marilyn Mosby and say, I don't want this to be like Fred Clay, so we need to make sure we get it right. And then had the nerve to say, and the African community understands that I'm going to do my very level best. this dude doesn't even know the difference between Africans and African Americans, and he's responsible for criminal law. Like, it is just so insulting. So my discharge integrity team, remember, I didn't work in the Suffolk County DA's office. I didn't know the people that I now supervise, and I didn't work with the Boston Police Department. I am an outsider. But even still, I have 4 people, a criminal defense lawyer, a community health leader, a retired Superior Court judge, and an active member of law enforcement, and I'm the 5th member. We meet out of my office. There is a complete wall between my office and these investigations, and we are presented evidence, and we direct and control that entire investigation. And one of the first things I did as DA was indict Trooper Sheehan, who is a state trooper who shot at a group of young men, and I believe it was all men, who were on quads going down 93 South. Trooper Sheehan was one of maybe 14 police officers, but the only one that went and got his long rifle and shot at them. And of course, the only one that has racist, social media posts and all these other things. So he's been charged, and he's been indicted by a grand jury, and we are waiting to charge him. So I reimagine where the community has a voice in what's happening. I reimagine where it is completely transparent instead of some black hole, or I'll say white hole, because I don't want black words to be like, I'm joking, right? But some black hole where we never see anything that's happening, and some years later, a report comes out that says, nope, Detective Ramirez did a great job. And meanwhile, a Terrence Coleman's mother or some other officer involved shooting that has happened still feels not only the hole in her heart of losing her son after trying desperately in every way possible to get him help without the police, but then the added disrespect of not being explained the process and then told the result, even if it is a negative one. So I re-envision community involvement, transparency, and a deep and profound and thoughtful process, as opposed to a 100% reactionary, let's just keep doing it the way we are without data, without evidence supporting, our policies and procedures. And I think we are in a moment now where we can actually possibly do it.
Just to follow up on that, and I think the DA sets a great tone in thinking about this. We have to lift up the names. How do we even get here? You think about Breonna Taylor, who's in her home, no knock warrant, and she loses her life. I think about Rayshard Brooks in my hometown, who's visibly running away from police officers and loses his life. I remember a Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old young boy playing in the park with a toy gun. We mentioned Eric Gardner, Freddie Gray, Ezell Ford, Botham Jean. I mean, the list sadly goes on. And I think one of the elements that we have to address is that America has yet to address its original sin of racism since slavery. And we understand that the operating and oversight of Black bodies extends back to slavery, which is very present in the functions of policing even to this day. And we know that racism permeates every aspect of our society, including our police departments. Furthermore, we have to acknowledge the realities that Black bodies in this country have been dehumanized. They've been vilified, they've been criminalized, hypersexualized, and many a times left vulnerable to mistreatment and brutalization. And we see that even in the moments of public lynchings like a George Floyd, or a public lynching like an Ahmaud Arbery. And I think one of the things that we have to ask ourselves, like, what does reimagining look like? And for me, I think it starts with where we put our money. If we follow the dollars, we see our priorities. In this country, we spend upward of $115 billion a year on policing. And that money could be, as we're calling, defunding or reallocated, reinvested into our education system. It could be reinvested into community programs that address the social determinants of health that produce violence. It could be reinvested into violence prevention programs. It could be reinvested into job training and economic opportunity. We have to also begin to consider what are the alternatives. Many of the instances that we're talking about that DA Rollins just suggested are situations where we actually don't need police officers. We could be using healthcare crisis teams, right? My wife's a psychiatrist. We could be putting together teams of healthcare practitioners and others that know how to deal and address with mental health crises and issues. We could be bringing forward issues where we could put together cohorts of people to address the homelessness and address addiction and not criminalize it, and continue to create more touch points in our criminal justice systems. We have to move to a place where non-serious, non-violent, non-dangerous actions do not involve police interaction. And I think what would be important for us is that we began the process of limiting police interactions and de-escalating practices that will continue to hold police officers accountable when they're dealing with people. We need, honestly, if we're going to think about it, we need civilian review boards. We need opportunities to not only oversee the procedures, the practices, but make sure that we're addressing police misconduct and brutality and police murders. I've always asked for this, that we need an independent investigator in relations to police shootings in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and pretty much in the country writ large. As the DA eloquently laid out, there is a collaborative relationship that is necessary with DAs and with police departments. And for transparency purposes, I suggest that we move this and create an independent office within the AG's office to oversee all of the police shootings in the Commonwealth. I think that's something that can be done. We need to maybe do a study, whatever needs to be done to make it happen, but we can be doing that work. I think policing looks like working collaboratively with community, not just door knocking, not just walking in the community for peace, but actually hearing the concerns of the people and actually hearing what needs to be done to address the issues that are prevalent. I've been protesting with people across our communities, across the Commonwealth. You know, we're talking about 55,000 people coming out into Franklin Park. We're talking about people each and every week standing up, speaking about a reimagination, a new vision for this country. I've been at the State House the past week, almost 6 times this week, on the State House steps, fighting for the Reform, Shift, and Build Act that came out of the Senate that passed 30-7. And right now, as we are speaking, the House is in deliberations on their bill right now to do the work that we're talking about, and that's police accountability. And so what we're looking for is that, you know, we should be banning chokeholds. You know, that should not be present. We should be banning practices that are chokeholds and other practices that cause harm towards those who are either having a civil infraction or just being present in communities. We should be creating standards of training that are high. Our tax dollars pay for policing, right? And they've committed an oath to both protect and serve. I believe that we should be removing qualified immunity, and that should be the end goal. Even though the bills right now that have been put forth in the Massachusetts House and Senate limits the scope, we should be moving towards removing qualified immunity for police officers. And then more importantly, I don't think that there should ever be a time where rubber bullets and tear gas is used on citizens utilizing their constitutional right to protest peacefully. And so I think there are things that we could be doing right now that would allow us to move in the direction of reimagining policing as we know it. And what we have to realize is that's going to be a fight, because anytime you're shifting the status quo, it's going to make people uncomfortable. And what we've done for so long is that we've kicked the can down the road doing nothing, that the marginal ask that we're asking for, I don't even think we're asking for something, but what we should have anyway. The marginal ask seems like it's earth shifting. And so I think we need to be prepared for a fight, and we need to continue to reimagine a world where policing looks different.
All right. I've been thinking a lot about reimagining policing, and I think we really need to reimagine how we spend municipal dollars, not just on policing, but on other things like education, like healthcare services, like mental health treatment and things of that nature. If I were to say what I think a core problem is, maybe not the only problem, but a core problem with policing is its culture, which is insular and which has a lot of racism in it. And the unions, the police unions, perpetuate that insulated, isolated, racist culture. That is not to say that all police officers are racist. There are many honorable and brave people who are doing what we don't want to do to protect us and are going places we don't want to go. So I am not anti-police, but I am anti activities by a police union meant to protect police officers who are engaged in dangerous, reckless policing. So when I look around the country at what people have done, I was really impressed with what Camden, New Jersey did. They actually defunded. They just didn't take a little bit of money from their police. They said, you're not going to get $1. That's it. You're done. $0. So if we were to do this in Boston, we would say, guess what? You're defunded. You're not getting $1 more. And we're dismantling the police department, which dismantles the union. And we're going to reimagine what policing could look like if we had a police and community board that could hire the officers they wanted to hire, not the ones who got the highest test scores on the civil service exams or the ones with vet preference, but people who had worked in diverse communities, were guardians of those communities, and had a record of making them stronger and safer. That's who we want on our police force. Could we do it? Well, how do you start? In our present system, I would, again, defund, dismantle, and create a non-unionized, narrower police force. So narrowing policing means reducing it to its essence. As Willie said, you know, when do we actually need an armed police officer and what percentage of the time? So in Race, Justice, and Reform, Commissioner Bard came to our class and I asked him, what percentage of the 911 calls in Cambridge require an armed police response? And he said an armed police response is required for serious felonies and for crimes that are ongoing. And he said only about 20% of our 911 calls relate to a violent crime or a crime in progress. So even by the most conservative estimates, you know, let's say in Boston, it's 50% require an armed officer to go somewhere. Could we reduce policing by 50%? So if we did that in Boston, the police budget is $414 million a year right now. Could we take $207 million and create non-police alternatives? What would that look like? We would have community intervention specialists. We would have mediators, social workers, EMT workers, mental health professionals who go on the scene. So if someone is sleeping in a car in a Wendy's parking lot, that is where a community intervention specialist would go, not an armed police officer. And they're not going to be stopping people for selling single cigarettes either. That's not an armed police required response. If there's a need to get people off the street, whether they're homeless or whether they have an overdose issue, that can be done by the EMTs, that can be done by community intervention specialists, it can be done by a lot of other people besides the armed police. So we reduce, we narrow, and then we reimagine. So we say, okay, now the community decides who to hire, who to fire, who to discipline, and how to create this new police force. It was interesting to me that when they did this in Camden, New Jersey, the police chief said, we were able to accomplish more reforms without a police union in 3 months than we had in the prior 5 years. So I think that what we need to think about are structural changes, not just changes around the edges. And structural changes are going to require us to fight hard, because on the other side are a lot of entrenched interests.
And I'll just add, it's $414 million plus $60 million in overtime, right? So, you know, the other thing we need from our government, you shouldn't have to have a Nobel Peace Prize in mathematics to read a budget. You shouldn't. All of the things for the police should be in one place. That's it. Every single dollar they get, and it should it should not be a different number than somewhere else when you look at what the police get. You know, we are, part of what is the most frustrating part of my job, one of them, is just how terrible the government is to all of us with respect to explaining things or recognizing that we as the government work for you, not the other way around. I will add, you know, I look at this with serious felonies, and we think of something like Operation Clean Sweep, where there was a corrections officer driving into work who rolled his window down. It started interacting with some people in the Mass Ave and Melnia Cass area. An altercation ensued. There were a small handful of people, including that corrections officer, that were engaged in violent or felonious behavior. Yet and still, 30 to 40 people were swept, and I don't like this word because it's usually used for trash, but it was the word chosen for Operation Clean Sweep, and picked up for things that were not felonies, right? And essentially, you know, there was a lot of reaction to that because the community had been raising its concerns for a while about that area, and nobody cared until a member of law enforcement got punched in the face, right? Number one. The other thing I just think is, I don't think the police or DAs, I don't think we're doing anything to help ourselves. So if you read the Globe, recently there was an article about, there's a captain in the Boston Police Department that has something like 6 or 7 open IAD, Internal Affairs Department, investigations, that one part of BPD said, yes, we're taking these very seriously and we're investigating all of those. And then later in the Globe article, it says that same captain received a commendation for the very behavior he's allegedly being investigated into IAD. So the police look crazy, right? They aren't even speaking to each other. One of the things I did as the general counsel of the MBTA, when I was several years ago, is I said, hey, before you promote and we have, between MassDOT and the T, there are 10,000 employees. In all of our senior staff meetings for both, I said, before anyone is promoted, given a public award, you know, uplifted and, you know, affirmed in public or written about in a positive way by anyone in our room, can you please just call me and check and see if there's any number of open investigations? Remember, we're the T. Since we started this Zoom, the T has probably been sued 17 times in the last 41 minutes, right? We have ethics complaints. We have Inspector General looking into us, federal, state, and local entities, because we have so many employees and we're doing so many different things in transportation and otherwise. But I just think those are important things. I think the union and I have had some battles because the union, the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association, has yet and still to denounce Derek Chauvin and the murder of George Floyd. And I just said, why is that so hard for you? Like, what would it require for you to say, this isn't us? Nobody needs to say it needs to be long. I'm not looking for an apology, but my point was Commissioner Gross immediately stood up and said it. He and I are a member of NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Officers. We issued a statement immediately, but I made clear Commissioner Gross is the face of the Boston Police. He's not in B2 in Roxbury. He's not in the gang unit in the middle of the night up and down Humboldt Ave, kicking indoors and asking questions and engaging in you know, fisticuffs with people. We need to know that the actual rank and file believe that what it is that happened was unacceptable, and you would not stand for that here. And what they don't recognize is by being silent, it's hurting me because I can't solve homicides now, right? Community's not coming forward and telling the police answers because they don't trust the police. And that results in me getting no bills in my grand jury because they don't trust the police witnesses we put in front of them, and not guilties in my trials because the police sit there smug and testifying, and half the jury thinks that they're completely full of you know what. So it's all connected.
Thank you for your insights on those questions. I think now, looking at the time, we can move into open questions, if that's all right with everyone. Bryn Duvall will be helping us out with a question. So if you have a question that you want to ask one of our panelists, please go ahead and raise your hand on the chat function, and Bryn will call on you.
Okay, so we do have a couple questions already. The first one, it looks like Angelica Jordan has a question.
Hi, I'm here. Thank you so much, panelists, for taking the time and opportunity to be here today. I'm currently a doctoral student working on the diversification of law enforcement and the reduction of officer-involved shootings. So to be here to hear your insight is definitely rewarding. I have a two-part question. The first is, do you think that there is an association between the diversification of law enforcement with an increased recruitment, hiring, retention of Black officers to reduce the reduction of officer-involved instances as it relates to Black victims? And then two is that with Congress having so many bills in place that kind of talk about independent review, data transparency, police reform, given the current state of politics, those, I guess, bills haven't been fully prioritized. What has to be done, whether it's through government, whether it's through the people, to make sure that we find some ways of acknowledging accountability in those regards?
So can I take the last question first? One of the things that frustrates me the most about the legislature, many of them are lawyers. Legislation is nothing if there is not, it isn't clear who is going to enforce it and who is going to fund it, right? So our crime bill from 2018 in Massachusetts looks great. We're supposed to all be sharing data and information with each other. This passed back in 2018. It's 2020 right now. We aren't doing it. Nobody's sharing data with each other because none of our systems speak to each other, our computer systems. And there's no enforcement provision, and there was no discussion of who was going to fund it. So for me, it is so frustrating. You know, I know that I'm very blunt and I don't mind being that way, but why I'm so frustrated is the people that get harmed in here. When I get called in the middle of the night and I'm woken up from my sleep and go out to a crime scene, it's Black and brown bodies that are on the ground. And what I like to remind people is, I guarantee you, if there were 3 15-year-olds murdered in West Roxbury, we would be able to solve crime in a nanosecond, right? The governor would have a sheltering in place. There would be a crisis because children were harmed. The school would open its gymnasium and psychologists would go in to talk to people about trauma. But when it's our communities, it's like, you're used to this, right? You've dealt with trauma. It's what Willie talked about. It's this sort of belief, and it goes back in health and medicine, that Black people don't feel pain somehow. So for me, I think we are getting failed by our electeds who write these beautiful things and have all these press conferences, but don't understand and don't speak to the people that actually have to implement what they're doing, to say, who's paying for it and who do we call when people aren't doing it, right? And what I don't want to hear is the Attorney General's office and it's a $3 fine every 6 years. Nobody's going to do it. Here's $100. I'll see you in 1100 years when this runs out, and my great-great-grandson will give you some more once it happens. There needs to be a significant fear of what is going to happen if we don't comply. And then, yes, I do firmly believe that we need law enforcement that actually reflects the community that it serves, that speaks the languages of the people in those communities, that have a tie. And it is tough, Professor Ramirez, because as the daughter of a veteran, I have a deep respect for veterans, and I do believe they should get a preference, but maybe every other year there's a veterans preference, or every 2 years there's a veterans preference. But what we aren't going to do is look at, you know, it's a cyclical problem, right? If you have a criminal record, you potentially can't join the military. But if we look at my father and all of his white Irish friends when they were younger, they should have been arrested thousands of times, I'm sure, before he personally went in and enrolled to join the Navy, but it was just that all the police officers knew who they were and said, Jackie, get home, right? Cut it out, give me, underage drinking, whatever, all the nonsense that they were doing. They just got the benefit of the doubt. We don't, right? We don't get the benefit of the doubt because there aren't people that we grew up with or know. And I'm not saying no one gets the benefit of the doubt anymore. Like, all of my policies aren't saying, let's pull white people down to poor people, right? No, I want everyone to get the same amazing potential opportunity when they touch the criminal legal system. So those are my responses.
Angelica, thank you for the question. I think I'll try to address the diversification because I think this is a very interesting conversation. I was just in a conversation with a bunch of brothers in the city with Michael Curry, who's a national board of NAACP. And one of the conversations that arose was this conversation around diversity in our law enforcement. We know that Black lives in blue are not always treated equitably or equally. I mean, in Boston, we just got over a hair test case that was, disproportionately impacting Black officers and many of them losing their livelihoods in the force. And we've been pushing at this, not only just in policing, but in all of our public service positions like fire as well. I also want us to nuance this conversation as we talk about diversity, because I do believe we need more people that look like us in our community. But we also want people who have not internalized the culture of policing and internalized the racism that policing culture has presented and exacted that upon the people that look like them as well. And so I do think we need to do a
Boys in the Hood. It's the scene in Boys in the Hood. Right.
Hoods, right? Just where Black officers also, so too, can be arms and powers of white supremacy and of systems that exact problems against Black bodies. And so, I heard numerous stories of, people being hurt, but it was a Black officer that did this to me. It was a Black officer that hurt me. It was a Black officer that abused my civil rights. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is not only address the diversity, but address the culture, so that even those who come into the force that are Black or brown or whatever, or Asian or others who are in these particular roles, don't exact upon the same ideologies of supremacy, white supremacy, that the white officers do as well. I mean, let's remember George Floyd. It wasn't just a white officer that was there holding him down. There were two other officers of color who were present, who either didn't intervene or were part of the process of holding down George Floyd. And so I think we need to have a broader conversation around diversity as we address changing, as Professor Ramirez talked about, the culture of policing. There's a blue wall of silence that is a very real thing. If you've dealt with any of the unions in Massachusetts, you know that it is a very real thing. And then there's another piece of this that, yesterday, the head of the Massachusetts Chiefs of Police Association came out and said, there is a liberal element that is attacking officers, right? And the problem is that, one, it's just not true, right? That we know that there are people on both sides of the aisle that are saying, look, what we're watching is problematic, right? But then there's another part of this that is continued to characterize any shifts in policies, any shifts and changes towards policing as some sort of political pandering. And so I do think a part of why we don't get legislation across is because we do have unions that are very much so deeply rooted in a part of a process that know how to fight back any type of change, and they are good at it. They've been, before these bills even touched the floor, they had already been calling. They had already been getting people on their side. They had already been, haggling their legislation. I mean, people who we know of good value, who should have stood on the side of right in our community, voted against the bill. And then they push, conversation, this was rushed, this was this. And the reality is, many a times, these bills have already gone through the Judiciary Committee. They've already gone through committee. They've already been studied. And they have just stood strong against pushing back on this. And so I think a big part of this conversation is also us being serious about voting and saying, if somebody does not represent our values, let's get them out. Let's remove them. I'm very comfortable with saying, let's work against those who do not stand for the values of the community. And hopefully that pushes us into a place in conversation where we can actually get leadership that represents our values, that represents our communities, that will actually stand up against those who are not trying to change the status quo.
And Professor, before you say anything, just, I have said so many times, whenever police talk about the no snitching policy, the blue wall of silence is the first and best no snitching policy in the world, right? Number one. And number two, you're absolutely right, Willie. They are mobilized, they are organized, they have administrative staff that help draft the letters that's going out. And guess what communities don't have? That, right? We, in the midst of COVID-19, many of the very communities where the crime is exploding right now are the communities that are hit with unemployment, evictions and foreclosures. They are our essential workers. They're also homeschooling right now. Many of their children are English as a second language or on an IEP, which both are failing in Zoom, right? We have all of these exacerbating factors that we're seeing regarding, the problems. And I think, Willie, that is one of the things I had wanted to do as an elected is we have to do a far better job at educating our community about the process, right? And nobody should be ashamed that they don't understand how the hell a bill becomes a law, right? We can pull out the old Schoolhouse Rock video and teach everyone how to do that, but I'm the DA. There's part of it is I'm like, it goes to a what now and a who and a, we need to be better at streamlining that, explaining it to the community, and then feeding that out to them, making it easy for them to inundate our electeds with the same calls that the police and their unions do all the time. Because, for me, it's outrageous, some of the things that I see happening up on the Hill now, and the information is completely false.
Yeah, and DA and Professor, right before you jump in, I agree with you 1,000%. And I think it's interesting because one of the things that we can see on the ground right now is that people trying to do that in a grassroots effort. And I agree with you 1,000% that we need a better process of what I call information circulation, right? Intellectual circulation in our communities, because many a times what happens on that hill, it seems like a very far distance from Roxbury, and it's literally less than 2 miles from down the way. And so I think what we need to do, I was encouraged by organizers who were posting the hearings till 4:12 in the morning, literally on their Facebook pages, so people could watch the hearings and hear some of the people that would have went in the silence. They would have went in silence with that vote. People were we were tweeting out the vote counts and tweeting out the various amendments. But I do think we do need to think critically about a comprehensive strategy for information circulation from government. And I think sometimes it's overly burdensome to put that on the community. That's why we elect people, right? That's why we elect people. That's why we have these offices. That's why we have these people that are in these particular positions, so that they can help lead in a way to actually get that information out to the people and engage. So I think that is a huge point, because so many people are not active many times because they just don't know.
Well, I want to address your point about accountability and about what we can do to try to stop police shootings and police stranglings. So I think you have to begin by understanding the problem. There's about 5% of the officers causing 80% of the problems. And if that's true, part of what we need is to identify them and to get them off the streets. And one problem that we have is that police chiefs cannot keep bad cops off the streets because the unions, through collective bargaining, have made it virtually impossible to fire a police officer, absent 8 minutes of videotaped strangling on the street, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, even when we sue the police officers themselves pay nothing. So Angelica, if you were to sue the police for misconduct or for strangling someone you loved or shooting someone you loved, even if you succeeded in court, and even if we abolish qualified immunity, right? And you get all the way through, you get $1 million verdict, you get a $5 million verdict. The police officers will pay not 1 penny because the unions, through collective bargaining, have been able to force the municipalities to pay 100% of the costs of police misconduct. And what does that mean for you, Angelica? It means that you as a taxpayer, me as a taxpayer, all of the 98 people on this feed, are going to pay 100% of the costs of illegal, unconstitutional, criminal police misconduct. So sometimes I think of this as like a parable. If a company were polluting water in a town and all the town residents were getting sick, and the solution were, oh, the taxpayers will compensate the town residents for the harm that's been done by that awful company, someone might say, why don't we go upstream, get them to stop the pollution and make them pay for the cost of their conduct? So what's the solution? Just as doctors must carry professional liability insurance, we are proposing that in order to police, every police officer must carry mandatory professional liability insurance. And as you know, when a doctor performs surgery on the wrong arm or the wrong leg, the doctor and the doctor's professional liability insurance pays the victim for the harm that was done. The taxpayers don't pay it, the doctor does. And that doctor's premiums are going to go up. And if the doctor continues to operate on the wrong leg or hand, those premiums are going to soar, and that doctor is going to be priced out of medicine. In the same way, officers with dangerous histories, tendencies, and indicators are going to be priced out of policing by premiums that reflect the actual risk of their dangerous behaviors. So those officers, and there are many in Massachusetts, who have criminal records for assault, who have driving under the influence, who have restraining orders for domestic violence, or who have 6 or 7 outstanding investigations, are priced out. Daniel Pantaleo, before he ever met Eric Gardner, had many disciplinary issues. He was in the top 2% of all New York police officers in terms of sustained, not just complaints, but sustained complaints. He had 2 separate lawsuits for illegal searches and a lawsuit that had been settled for an illegal strip search, and another suit for crashing his police car into another car, a disciplinary record, on and on it goes. If this system had been in place long before he ever met Eric Gardner, he would have been priced out of policing. We need an independent system of accountability. The insurance company and the actuaries, right now, this is what they do. They assess risk. They price out bad drivers. They price out bad lawyers. They price out bad doctors. Let's send in independent actuaries who are unrelated to the police unions, and let's have them begin to price out bad police officers.
So for me too, look at Derek Chauvin, 17 or 18 infractions. If you or I worked at Sephora and were late twice, we'd be fired, right? And the police are the only branch of our government or element of our law enforcement or government of any type that have the ability to kill you, literally kill you, use lethal and legal force without any oversight in the moment. And where the police get it twisted with me is, we aren't friends. Yes, we go into court, or my office goes into court with you, but when you discharge your weapon or harm, I investigate you, right? And what we need to start thinking about is, you know, for me, I struggle sometimes, Willie, and this is a really interesting thing, with releasing the power of the DA to investigate officer-involved shootings, because what I get frustrated about is now that there are actually progressive DAs that are stepping up and running, and I've just Andy Dufresne'd my way through a 1-mile, you know, tunnel of you know what to get this job. I'm like, oh no, the hell you are not taking that away from me to give it to an attorney general's office that handles a small handful of criminal cases, none of which are violent, none of which are homicides, and overwhelmingly what will happen is someone will be specialed outside of the office to do this investigation who's just a previous ADA. Now, I have no problem saying you can do that for certain DAs who have not, you know, set up a discharge integrity team or met the call of the moment and looked differently at how we were doing this and had community involvement. But it is really hard that once, you know, I jokingly, it's like once women get to a position, or once people of color or women of color get there, it's like, let's change everything. It's like, right, as a result of the hundreds of years of those mofos that have been doing it wrong, not us. So it's hard. It is if this were easy, I think we would have, you know, this would have been resolved earlier. But I think what is so beautiful about this moment is we're now talking about it, right? I just recently wrote a letter to the legislature, Michael Witz, as well as Speaker DeLeo, on this very point. I'll send it to you, Willie, about, look, I want to keep my ability to investigate all deaths, because the people of Suffolk County put me in charge of this and believe that I can do it well. And look at how we're doing this. Look, we have community voices, we have the criminal defense bar, we have the judiciary. We are doing it right, and we're the first in the nation. Let's try to have it done this way, as opposed to just, you know, and again, all due respect and love, but as opposed to giving it to an AG's office, and we currently have 7 open state police scandals that no arrests, right? So I'm like, no, I want to handle this because I've indicted them. I'll hold them accountable. We're going to do it. So it's going to be interesting to see what ends up happening.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. I'm just looking at the clock. This is an exciting conversation.
Yeah,
but
like 5 other questions.
Yeah, there are many questions in our line, and I want to keep us moving. This is exciting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chase. So the next question, it looks like Jacob.
Hi, sorry, there we go. My camera's on now. First, thank you to Chase for moderating a really great discussion, and thank you to the panelists. I admire all of you just so much. My question is for Professor Ramirez. I actually grew up in Camden County, New Jersey. My grandmother lived under the Ben Franklin Bridge, and I spent a lot of time at the Kroc Center on Harrison Avenue. And I was there when they were sort of like reimagining the whole police system. And some of the things that they found is, instead of it being city police, they opened up to the whole county. And the rest of Camden County is a whole lot whiter than the city of Camden is. So they actually saw that the percentage of white officers increase, as well as the total number of officers in the city increase. And likewise, the number of excessive force complaints also increased after this happened. So my question is basically, when we are doing the work of reimagining these institutions, how can we do so in a way that doesn't activate the same usual suspects? And how can we make them so that they are actually holding themselves accountable and making sure it's an equitable, more transparent system?
That is a great question. You know, the one part of, I like the fact that they actually defunded. I like the fact that they dismantled, but I was so disappointed in what they reimagined. And then, you know, when we started to do the research, we understood they were not trying to change policing. They were not trying to transform policing. They were not trying to create a new culture. It was all fiscally driven. They didn't have enough money to keep paying their police force. And the only way they could put more police on the street was to defund and dismantle and not have a union so that they could afford to have the number of police on the street that they needed. So I would say what I liked about Camden is the idea. What I disliked is what they did with the idea. And what I was hoping is that if your goal were different, not just fiscally, how can we put more police on the street, right? Which was their goal. But if your goal is, how can we create true community policing in which the community is at the table, deciding in the first instance, because the best way to get rid of bad police officers is not hire them in the first place, right? How can we start getting the people we want? They may or may not be veterans. They may or may not be gifted at test taking on the civil service, but how can we get the people we want in there? How can we keep them? How can we discipline them? How can we terminate? You know, and how do we change culture? You know, one way you can change culture is require public service so that the insularity is broken by them seeing the community, not just at their worst moments, but at their best moments as well. But, you know, you could write volumes about that. But I think you're right that it's an interesting idea. They didn't implement it in a way that really transformed the culture of policing, but that wasn't their goal.
And I get, and back to like 2 questions before, what always makes me, why are we thinking about this? If a mayor had a backbone and looked at his chief of police, which by the way, he or she appointed, it's not, this isn't an equal position. You're down here and I gave you your job. You didn't run for office, I did. If I have police officers that are getting $5,000, $500,000 settlements or judgments, I look at my commissioner and say, you know what, you don't have $7 million in your budget next year. Handle that or I will, right? That's it. It's like, and you don't, no overrides, right? That's it. You have $414 million, but you have $14 million of settlements or judgments. Guess what your budget is next year? 400 million? Yes, correct. Because I'm taking that money out that we had to spend, and here's a penalty as a result of it. Make do with what you can. Clean up your thing. I mean, we do this to schools all the time, right? We do this to all of these other things that report up to the mayor, and nobody bats an eye when our children are like using pencils from the 1800s, right? And teachers are buying all of their supplies, right? So I think we can have, if we had mayors that were bold enough to do it, I think this could be resolved very, very quickly. And then the only other thing, I have to say this, as a person that worked at the National Labor Relations Board and has a master's in law and labor and employment, we can't only be kicking these unions down, because if anyone has a collective bargaining agreement that you think is outrageous, management had to agree to that, okay? And you know who management is? The mayor and the commissioner, right? They're sitting on the other side of that union and saying, sounds good, where do I sign? Perfect. And then everyone kicks the union in the face for getting a great result for their membership. I'm not hating on them about that. They're protecting their membership. That's what unions are supposed to do. We just need a bold negotiator with a spine of steel on the other side to say, guess what, guys? No. The answer is no. And the climate we're in right now, all 4 of our Boston Police Union contracts are up for negotiation right now. So it is myopic to be looking at the State House for legislation that's helping when we aren't also demanding transparency in these collective bargaining negotiations and what the mayor's position is going to be on all of these different things, because he'll tell us, because he's up for re-election next year. So we have a perfect storm, a Halley's Comet moment where, Willie, if we are all strategic and focused, we can come out of this not just with legislation, but with a mayor and a contract of 4 of our collective bargaining agreements making massive and profound changes.
And can I jump in really quickly, because I think there's an interesting point here. I think the police unions operate differently. On this past week, we were out there with SEIU, who's a union, who's fighting on behalf of them. They're standing on the side of reform. They're standing on the side of police accountability. And I think police unions have many a times not operated as a normal union. I would go as far to even say maybe we should take the power of appointing commissioners out of the hands of a mayor, period, so that we can force more transparency when we're looking at who's going to be leading our police departments. And I would go as far to say the same thing for the governor, right? That we should put these, for the mass state of police, we need to put the power in the hands of the people, because we can actually start to evaluate their records. And when they go wrong, we can hold them accountable. Now, is voting a foolproof effort? I would be the first one to say no. I've been many campaigns, many elections. I know it's not. However, I do think the public exposure of who's going to be in office without some side of transparency and engagement with their record, what was in their departments, who do they oversee, why do they let certain officers stay on the roll, on the payroll, doing the work of digging into their records, I think would change who stands in front, who's going to negotiate, and who's going to fight on our behalf. But I think in the most immediate fights that we have, I agree with you. With the system as we have it, we need to hold our mayor accountable and make sure that he stands strong and fights for some type of radical change.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say something about the unions. I'm not anti-union. I'm not even anti-police union. And I agree with you, Rachel. They're doing what they are supposed to do, which is advocating on behalf of the police officers. But structurally, there are problems that enable them to get things that they ought not to be able to get. So, you know, to say that we hope that someday the mayor stands up and says, look, the school children in Boston are not going to continue to pay the bill for police misconduct because it comes out of the Boston budget, and then we don't have money for opening up the schools or early childhood education. I hope and pray one day the mayor says that. But if he doesn't and the mayor's office changes, there are structural issues here. So the Boston Globe has said, look, why doesn't the state legislature narrow the scope of collective bargaining for police unions? Here is the contract with Minneapolis where George Floyd was strangled to death. It says it limits oversight discipline, which all of the agreements do, and it requires the city to pay the costs relating to police misconduct, including giving paid leave under investigation and paying all legal fees. And that is what's happening here in Boston. There isn't a single case of police misconduct that the city doesn't pay for. And that really means it's not just the taxpayers, it's the poor children in those urban districts who don't get lead paint poisoning tests, or who don't get early childhood education. And that could be changed. It could be that as a matter of public policy, we say, police unions are not able to negotiate through collective bargaining about who pays the costs of their legal
misconduct. Yeah, I agree. And you know what? Another word for paid administrative leave is vacation. And I want to be put on paid administrative leave, please. If there's a way that somebody can figure that out. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, these are great. Let's get another question.
It looks like the next person on our list is Misa. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Hi. My name's Malia. Sorry, Misa's my roommate, and I had her raise her hand for me too. I'm also though like a Northeastern alum. I guess I love that this education is coming top down from people who are in the know about what's going on, from DA Rollins herself, from law professors at Northeastern, from everybody. But then again, because the situations at hand the accountability is to some extent on citizens procedurally, I'm wondering like what can everyday individual people do? So I know DA Rollins ran on a platform to end cash bail, and that there's been pushback from the governor. How can we as citizens help promote that so that, Boston looks like San Francisco? Or, we can have different counties, instead of appointed DAs, we can have elected DAs. And then finally, again, right, like is putting in this legislative work, is it just staying in the know and making sure we sign the petitions, or kind of what actionable items are there on the table?
Yeah, so I'll just talk a little bit about the things you mentioned. So every single DA in Massachusetts, there are 11 of us, we're all elected. There's only, I think, 2 places in the United States where DAs are appointed, but there's about 2,300 elected prosecutors. Some of us are called DAs, Commonwealth attorneys, states attorneys, but it's all the sort of same thing. You're right. I ran on a platform explaining that bail is a system that essentially penalizes poverty. If Professor Ramirez and I do the exact same crime, and if a bail is set for $5,000 for each of us, and if Professor Ramirez can pay that $5,000 pre-trial, she goes home that day after, a couple little forms are signed and the $500 is hand over. If I can't, I go to Nashua Street and I sit there until my trial. And literally the exact same crime. So that is, by definition to me, the penalization of poverty. One of the things I ran on, Malia, was this list of 15 or so types of crimes that are all non-violent, non-serious, that really are clogging up the criminal legal system on the municipal and district court level. I'm not talking about superior court cases that are, rape, armed assault with intent to murder, homicides, not violent, serious crimes. I'm talking about Mass Ave and Melnia Cass. I'm talking about operating on a suspended license, right? And not as a, habitual offender who has the worst driving record in the history of the world, as somebody who doesn't have the $508 to pay those fines and get their situation cleaned up. And why I made that list is because certain communities have too many interactions with law enforcement that can escalate in a second. And that's what we saw with George Floyd, right? George Floyd should have been issued some sort of a ticket or a citation when he walked out, and they should have walked away. And the police have to be better at, when people are agitated or speak to them in a way that they don't think is respectful, only one of them is the government. And we as the government have to be on our best behavior at all times. You as a resident don't. And so one of the things on my list, for example, is a standalone resisting arrest charge. Because even if you aren't a lawyer, Malia, if you just get charged with resisting arrest, what were they arresting you for, right? What was the underlying thing? It's one thing if I go to you and I witness you committing a felony in my presence and I'm going to arrest you for it. And then you punch me in the face and we have a struggle and I charge you with armed robbery as well as resisting arrest. Okay, that's fine. But why I did all of this is for very good reason. It was meeting with the community, hearing about all the touches they have with law enforcement that are overwhelmingly not positive. And then there has been tremendous pushback by the governor, by the Fraternal Order of Police, by the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association, by the Secretary of Public Safety, additionally by judges. And then remember, I won my election by beating the person that everyone in my office voted for, right? Their former peer of the chief of the gang unit, I beat. So I showed up at work and now I have a staff of 350 people. I'm not saying that are all actively working against me, but they certainly all wanted somebody else in this role. So turning that culture around in my office, the same way that Professor Ramirez has said, the culture of the police is one of the hardest things to change. The culture of prosecutors is exactly the same, right? We hate admitting we're wrong. Look at how long it takes for people to be actually innocent people to be exonerated is 20, 25, 30. We just helped somebody who's 49 years he has served and he's now home. He's been fighting since the moment in 1972 when his verdict was, came down. So we need you to stand up and support us, whether it's on social media, whether it's getting involved in assisting with a campaign, whether it's, doing even, not even for money, but there are friend raisers, right? Where you introduce other people to a candidate that you really like. Because right now, I don't know what anyone's financial situation is. We're all just trying to make it by. But if you introduced, let's say you have a state rep that you just love, have a friend raiser for them. Say, look, we're all poor right now. We're just trying to make it through a global pandemic and get our children through homeschooling and whatever else. But I can introduce you to 50 of my friends. One half an hour, we'll all get on a Zoom. You have our undivided attention. Malia, that could be 50 more votes for that person, ultimately. And if you guys are multipliers, that's what I like to think of. If Malia sees me today and says, wow, I really like her, you might tell 2 friends about that. Or if Kenny Lofton is gonna run for office and you end up somehow reaching out to him and having a friend raiser, it's not always about money. There are many other ways you can help.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Bryn?
The next person that I saw on this list that had their hand raised first was Lindsay, but I know that a couple other people do want to ask questions, so I'm not sure if we'll be able to squeeze in one more quick question. Yeah, but the next person's Lindsay.
My question is just thank you all so much for this panel. As a third-year law student here at NUSL, thinking about our community, I'm wondering, how do we bring change, reform, and transparency to the private police force here on our campus, the NUPD? Since the NUPD is not subject to the public records request, yet they interact with surrounding community members in Dorchester, Roxbury, and beyond, and not just students. And we've even seen them at the protests here in Boston recently.
Ooh, that's a great question, Lindsay. And as a recent NUSL alum, I definitely think critically about this now. I think one of the first things, and just to answer the previous question as well, is that you have to make noise. You have to let people know that there is an issue. Many times people are mired in their everyday, particularly as law students, as I know there's enough work to go around, particularly during a global pandemic, for you to be, caught up in and trying to figure out whether you're going on co-op or you're doing some other things, or you're transitioning into your classes. But people need to know that there's an issue. I think there's an opportunity, particularly when it comes to campus police in relation to communities, is connecting with organizations that are in the community that are also affected by, Northeastern University Police Department. I think we need to make this known to the president. We have a dean, we have a president of the university. Let them know that this is an issue. And then we have advocates and alums who are in very powerful positions that can also push our institution. Yeah, I'm talking about Rachael Rollins right now, and others to push our institution.
And your general counsel is a NUSL alum, Ralph Martin, right? Okay,
So,
go ahead. Yep.
DA as well of Suffolk County. So I think one of the things that we're going to do is do the organizing work. It's hard to do that organizing work during this time. I recognize that, but I do think getting the information out, circulating that information, and ensuring that people know what the issues are, and then being clear about what the asks are. I think that's important as well. Being clear about our demands. What do we want to see happen? What does actionable change look like? And I think that goes along not just for NUSL, for our community in Northeastern, but also for the community at large. One of the things I've been encouraged by is everyday community persons using Zoom and Facebook Live to call their state rep to the table and say, look, why did you vote this way? Like, what was it? The community wants to know. And you're seeing upward to 300 and 400 people, 125 comments, like a local news station that the news just doesn't cover. And I think there's the opportunity for us to manage and control intellectual circulation, to demand accountability from our representatives, whether they're in the House, whether they're in the state Senate, whether they're in city council, whether they're the mayor or the governor, and ensuring that we're bringing that information to the table. Right now, actually, you can call your state rep in your district right now, wherever you are, and call them and ask them to push forward police reforms right now. Like, literally, you can go to the Mass State House website. I think it's ma@house.gov or something like that. You'll find it. And you can be calling your state rep right now about the deliberations that they're having, letting their staffers know, look, this is what we stand for. These are the issues we want to see moved upon, and this is what we want to see progress. So, Lindsay, to your question, I think, really doing the organizing work. I've seen some stuff on the NUSL page, but expanding the scope of those persons who are in the work and making sure that the people that can make some decisions be a part of your efforts.
And Lindsay, what's great is you're a voting block, right? Like, I don't know whether as a student you've switched I don't know where you're originally from, but whether you vote here in Boston or you vote somewhere else, it's not just state reps, it's your Boston city councilors as well, right? Right now in police reform, it's all police. People don't care about whether it's state police, municipal police, Boston police, transit police, NUSL police. So for me, you're right. Like, if these officers are coming into our community, it's not like you're a gated university, right? You are plopped right square in the middle of Roxbury. You're right down the street from the Boston Police headquarters right there. One of the things, for example, I'll give you a real example of being loud, is we charged a woman with involuntary manslaughter for a suicide that happened at a garage at Northeastern. When I got a call from the transit police a couple months later about a suicide that happened at a garage at Northeastern, I said, which one? He said, the same one. So I'm like, the same one that Alexander Ortulo jumped off of? Yes. Christmas 2019, December 25th, a mother from West Roxbury drove to that same garage. And by the way, after the second one, I said, can you please call Northeastern and tell them that they need to put something up on the top of that garage, right? Christmas 2019, a mother from West Roxbury throws her 2 children off of the garage and jumps. 3 lives gone, 2 homicides, 1 suicide. And I literally called my former mentor, NUSL alum, and said, by the time I get to my press conference, if you have not either gone to Home Depot and bought some rakes and glued them up there, written a sign yourself, or done something, I am lighting this school up. There are 5 people that lost their life on this. So we can't sit still. And I can tell you, there were many people in my administration that were like, oh, don't rock the boat and you got to say it nicely. No, you don't, right? When there are things that are happening that are that grave, you make noise, and noise is often heard. So I strongly encourage you, and then think about it. If you don't get the answer that you want, if you're a voting bloc, you can start saying, look, we want a candidate that does the following. We come back to school. We're in school when this election happens. We are going to be voting in this election. What are you going to do for us?
I know that time is out, but I do know that Shayla with the CPCS does have a quick question she would like to ask. So if you all can stay for a minute or 2 more.
Thank you, Bryn. It'd be super, super, super quick. My name's Attorney Montblair. I'm with CPCS in Suffolk County. I'm also on Attorney Ramirez's task force for police reform and reentry. Ms. Rollins, I like to say I've seen the difference that you actually have made in Suffolk County with a lot of the minor offenses that were BS that we were really pissed off about in the beginning being disposed of. So I like to say I actually see that work and how you change that culture. So thank you for that. Since we're on the topic of like the noise that people create in protesting, I actually led and organized the Public Defenders March this year. And as I guess my question to Rachael Rollins is, now knowing kind of the issues, I think everybody's kind of known, but now since there's like a spotlight on kind of the issues with as far as like policing and some of the force used, is there an approach you're taking with resulting protest cases? I know some of the cases that have come to my desk, there are some that are well worth the back and forth and the litigation for sure. But I know there are like a few that I look at and I'm like, wait a second, these are the same things I kind of did.
Absolutely. And I love that. And so remember, is it Shayla? Is that your name?
Yeah.
It says Shayla. So for me, I'm only as good as the information I have. And remember now, so I was sitting on the 7th floor of One Bullfinch thinking, hey, I wrote these great policies. I bet you they're all being implemented. But thank God, because I ran for office, so many public defenders, criminal defense lawyers, community members have my number. And I can't even tell you how many texts I get to say like, I'm sorry, did you change all of your policies? Because you know it's not happening. Any of them in Roxbury Division of Boston Municipal Court. And so remember, even though, you know, that's not the greatest text to receive, I need those texts because my staff is saying, yes, we're doing everything that we say, or no, that was different and we didn't. So I want it open, right? Is it harder now for me and my job than I think it was for the 15 men that had it before me? Yes, but that's okay. I signed up for this. What we need to do is when you see, Shayla, something that's not consistent with my policies, you say to my staff, I don't think this is consistent with the DA's policies. And if they say, yes, it is, then you say, all right, due respect, I'm going to kick it up just because I think my client deserves better than this. And honestly, I think the policy is clear that she's not going to prosecute. All right. At which point you hopefully now have my number, or before you leave, I can, privately message you my number. And I want to know when that isn't happening. And the answer might be, you know what, Shayla, actually, we look at this a little differently and let me explain why. Or you are absolutely right. This is not consistent with my policy. Let's do it. But your client should not, the person who loses in all of this, Shayla, is your client, not my staff member who just wants to be right? Or you that might have interpreted a policy one way or another. My policy is the First Amendment matters, right? And you know, absent somebody blowing up a police car or, you know, throwing a brick into a police officer's face, which are all things that unfortunately have happened. What I am not going to deal with is, you know, 30 elderly people from a temple coming to the Suffolk County House of Corrections and protesting peacefully about ICE detainees inside, all getting arrested by deputy sheriffs, and me saying before they even got there, null pros every one of those cases. I'm watching Ozarks and I'm not interested in dealing with any of this, right? Like, we're not going to prosecute people that don't have criminal records and that are exercising their First Amendment right. Where the list of 15 doesn't include is violent, serious crimes. And, you know, yes, there were some juveniles that burnt a Boston police car. We found them and we held them accountable. But there were tens of thousands of people that were out in the streets, righteously outraged, but lawfully, you know, engaging in their First Amendment rights. The stories weren't about them. The stories were about the two individuals that burnt a police car, and then of course saying, and DA Rollins isn't going to hold them accountable because she thinks everyone should be out in the streets rioting. So that's a long way of saying, I'm going to give you my number right now. I am only as good as the information I have. I would like to believe that some of this is not intentional, but I certainly think there are people in my office that are not happy with some of the policies. And if you don't think they're being implemented, you call me and tell me.
Thank you. And I totally get that. And I mean, I've been doing this work for near 4 years, so I definitely understand, even with me being biased and how I view the world and what policing should look like. There are some facts that have come across my desk that are just literally the same things I've done. When I was protesting, when I put together the march together, and it's just, it's upsetting. I mean, I filed a 30-page motion to dismiss and made statutory arguments, constitutional arguments, and argued it, and even the judge was just like, I'm going to look at this, but obviously my client has somewhat of a Corey, and I think that becomes problematic, but even that for me is an issue, because it's, if we're looking at somebody who has a long Corey, maybe that's a person who has more passion about protesting than most people, because they understand.
And or think about all the disparities and decisions about how people are charged. You know, Shayla, I have a record. I, at 19, was charged with something and was told by a criminal court-appointed lawyer, just quaff it. You don't have enough time to come back. I had to drive back up to Northampton to, you know, and I was home and I was trying not to have my parents know. I mean, it was nothing, it was a misdemeanor, nothing serious, but she said, just quaff it. It'll never bother you. You know, it'll go away. Well, really? Prior to me getting the Globe endorsement for DA, I was grilled about my criminal record and an arrest that I allegedly had. And I said to them, it says arrest. And I know you're envisioning me driving down a highway at 100 miles an hour, throwing bricks of cocaine and like money out of my car while shooting off a rifle. I got a summons in the mail and was charged with larceny under 250, right? Like, I showed up and it was quaffed, and then I never got in trouble again. And that was when I was 19. And they said, why didn't you expunge it? Why didn't you seal it? And I said, because this is why, right? I've graduated from some of the greatest universities in the world. I have won millions of awards. I am going to be the next DA of Suffolk County. And you just spent 7 minutes of my 11-minute interview asking me about an arrest when I was 19. And I'm going to be fine if I don't win. What about the kid from Charlestown that doesn't have anyone advocating for him and her, or somebody from the Dominican Republic that doesn't have anyone advocating for them? This criminal brand on their record is going to follow them for the rest of their lives. This is why we need reform. And then, of course, I got the Globe endorsement, but, you know.
And that leadership, I just want to quickly say, is so important, especially for youth, because someone like you, people, I mean, my upbringing was very different. I had both parents that struggled with substance use disorder. I was lucky enough that they got clean. I've seen my uncles in and out of prison, used to come and stay with us because they had nowhere to stay. I've been passionate about this, the field I'm in, my whole life. And I think leadership like your leadership and what it looks like, what you make that look like, is important for people who have gotten in trouble and feel like, oh, well, now I'm screwed. I can do nothing else with my life.
Tell them now they could be the next DA of Suffolk County, right? That's amazing.
No,
and good work, Shayla. Thank you for that.
I think that's important to tell that story because many a times we get a cookie cutter narrative from everybody. And the reality is all of our stories are complicated. If you're Black and brown in this country, there are many of us who've had interactions, who have records, who can speak about being arrested or speak about various interactions we've had and have a sense of honest integrity about those realities and be able to say it can get better. Life can go forward. And you can acknowledge that the people who are dealing with these issues, their humanity. You know their issues, and you recognize that but for the grace of God, in my opinion, I could have been them. And that type of empathy is what we need in leadership. I think that type of empathy is what's necessary, because what happens so many times is that people have narratives that cannot even cross the barriers or the chasms that have been created between the communities that they serve, and it plays out in the outcomes that we see in our neighborhoods.
I know I already spoke, but one more last thing. I think what we should all take out of this, or what the message I'd love to send is, if anything, hope is what matters the most, especially when you're talking about youth, because once you cut their hope, once you make them feel like they're not as important because of the way that they look, once you make them feel like they're not as important because they messed up once because they didn't have guidance, or they just had one bad run-in, or there was some racial bias or discrimination on how to deal with it, once we cut that off, once communities feel like once you have a Corey, you no longer matter, hope and the way that the value we're putting on human life and the value we're putting on just people in general and what we can offer and what we can give and contribute to communities and to our whole being and what our gifts are. I think that's so important, because we could change legislation, we can change all of that stuff, but as long as we don't have everybody on board at what human value is, we get nowhere.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are over time. These are all wonderful questions, and we could talk about this for so long. But I want to give a huge thank you to all of you who attended and to our fantastic panelists. Thank you to each of you for making the time to come speak with us. And I hope that we continue to have these conversations in the future. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.